Have you ever wondered how just 13 small colonies on the edge of North America managed to defeat the most powerful empire in the world? This is the story of the American Revolutionary War, 1775–1783, a struggle that changed history forever. The American Revolutionary War was one of the first conflicts in history to be fought over political representation. It was also the first war where the opposing sides were fighting over abstract ideals like liberty and democracy. And it was this commitment to these ideals that allowed the underdog patriots to triumph over the mighty British Empire. To understand how this happened, let's start with how the war began. As early as the 1620s, European powers had established colonies in what would become the United States. Initially, these colonies developed with very little interference from Europe. But after France and Britain went to war over colonial territories in India, everything changed. Britain began to see its American colonies as a source of revenue that could help pay for the costly war effort. So it passed a series of increasingly unpopular laws to raise money in the colonies, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. These acts sparked widespread protests in the colonies. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts and protests against British goods, and colonial legislatures began to pass their own restrictive laws in response to the British. Tensions escalated even further when British soldiers were deployed to enforce the new laws. The situation became so volatile that 5 members of the British Parliament resigned rather than support reconciliation with the colonies. On March 5, 1770, tensions boiled over in Boston when British soldiers fired on a crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 5, known as the Boston Massacre. This event only inflamed anti-British sentiment in the colonies. By the mid-1770s, the relationship between Britain and its colonies had broken down completely. The final straw came when Britain passed the Tea Act in 1773, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. In protest, colonial groups like the Sons of Liberty organized a boycott of British tea. Then, on December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 British ships carrying tea to colonial merchants and dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. The British responded by closing the port of Boston and sending more troops to the city. Soon, the other colonies got involved. By 1774, colonial delegates met in the First Continental Congress to coordinate a response. They agreed to boycott all trade with Britain and established the Continental Association to enforce the boycott. When the British passed the Coercive Acts in 1774 in response to the Boston Tea Party, the colonies' resolve to resist only grew. The Intolerable Acts, as they were known in the colonies, consisted of 4 laws that were designed to punish Massachusetts for its defiance. They closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, barred town meetings without the consent of the governor, allowed British officials to be tried in England rather than in the colonies, and provided for the quartering of British troops in civilian homes. The other colonies protested the intolerable acts by providing financial aid to Massachusetts. And in September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia to coordinate their response. The situation was now spiraling out of control. King George III wanted to use force to put down the rebellion, but his councillors advised him to wait until the next session of Parliament so they could get public support for a crackdown. In the meantime, the king ordered 2 regiments to take up positions in Boston. In April 1775, the British decided to seize 2 colonial military supply depots near Boston, and on April 19, 1775, a company of British regulars and an armed militia clashed at Lexington and Concord. The British suffered heavy casualties and retreated back to Boston. This marked the beginning of the armed conflict that would become the American Revolutionary War. During the first year of the war, the Patriots won some important victories. But despite their success, they were still vastly outnumbered by the British. So the war was far from over. In fact, the British had not even deployed their full military might yet. In the summer of 1775, General William Howe arrived in Boston with 20,000 British troops and took command of the city. He soon began a campaign to clear the New England colonies of Patriot forces. His first target was the city of Boston. With the city under siege by Patriot forces, Howe knew that he had to act quickly. He sent a proposal to the Patriots offering to exchange prisoners. If the Americans would allow food and medical supplies into the city, John Hancock and Samuel Adams refused, however, saying that the city could not surrender unless the British left the entire continent. Howe then made a counteroffer stating that the British would evacuate Boston if the Patriots withdrew from the surrounding hills. The Patriots rejected this offer as well, so Howe hatched another plan. He proposed that he would evacuate Boston by sea and then surprise the Patriots by seizing Dorchester Heights overlooking the city. In return, the Patriots would withdraw across the Charles River and allow British troops to leave Boston with their arms and baggage. Again, the Patriots agreed, and on March 17, 1776, British troops evacuated Boston and took up positions in New York, but the British victory in Boston was the last major win of the war for King George II. At this point, the war began to turn in favor of the Patriots. One reason for this was that the American people were fighting for a cause they believed in. Historian Bernard Bailyn has argued that the war was fought over the issue of political representation. The American colonists felt that they were being taxed without representation and that their rights as Englishmen were being violated. This was not simply a desire for independence, but a demand for a greater voice in the affairs of their empire. Another reason for the Patriot victory was the leadership of men like George Washington, who kept the army together during the darkest days of the war and eventually led them to victory. Finally, the Patriots were helped by foreign powers, especially France. While officially remaining neutral at this stage, French leaders saw the war as an opportunity to weaken their rival, Britain. French military and naval officers traveled to America to observe the war firsthand and report back to their government. Their reports were glowing, and in 1776, France began to provide military and financial aid to the Patriots. As the war dragged on, the British began to face serious problems. Unlike the Americans, the vast majority of whom were fighting on their home soil, the British Army was made up of soldiers who were far from home and had been hired to fight in a war that most of them did not believe in. In addition, the British public grew tired of the war and the heavy taxes needed to pay for it. The turning point came in 1781 when British forces surrendered at Yorktown after being defeated by combined American and French forces. The war would drag on for another 2 years, but the outcome was never in doubt. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the war and recognizing the independence of the United States. The newly created nation would go on to become one of the most powerful and influential countries in the world, and the ideals of liberty and democracy that had been so central to the war effort would inspire revolutions in other parts of the world. But this would not have happened if it was not for the sacrifices made by the 13 colonies on the edge of North America. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Thanks for watching.